Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I hope you are doing well, and I hope everyone enjoyed their draft weekend. It was an interesting one, to say the very least, and a very productive, polarizing, and at times a little predictable, but unpredictable as well, first class for Zach Taylor. We're going to talk about all the stuff with the NFL draft and the Cincinnati Bengals, what they did, what they didn't do, maybe even a little bit about what their division rivals did in this draft, because based on this division and the outlook of it in 2019, the Bengals and their fans had their eyes on the periphery of what those other teams are doing. But the Bengals added 10 new rookies and a crop of undrafted free agents. We'll talk about all of those players, what it means for the team going ahead, the picks we liked, the picks we didn't like, and we'll be getting, hopefully, to some listener questions at the end of the show. So get those to us in the live YouTube chat. Get those to us on Twitter at BengalsOBI, in the comments section at cincyjungle.com, or you can text us at 949-542-6241. We'll be taking calls hopefully at the end of the show as well. And I want to welcome in my co-host, John Sheeran. John, it was a fun weekend, but it was a busy weekend, I'm sure, for you and I, and many others at Cincy Jungle. Kudos to you on all the coverage. Kudos to Jason Markham on the coverage. Matt Minich and Nick Manchester, truly a team effort over at cincyjungle.com. I tried to do a little bit more of the media stuff for this program, but good job. I hope you're recovering from all of the work, my friend.
Shout out to the Bengals for trading up 2 times, getting rid of a couple of those 6-round picks. Would have had a little bit more work to do. So,
yeah, I guess we can start there, because the Bengals were set. What they initially had, 13 picks, 12 picks?
They had 11.
11, that's right.
And then in Friday night, it turned to 13, thanks to a usual trade back in the second round.
There we go. That's the one. Yeah, so I had a couple of the numbers right. Just a matter of what point in time you were asking about it. And then, of course, they moved up a couple of times in the fourth round, shed some of those picks, and they ended up with 10 overall draft picks, and of course, the class of undrafted free agents that they brought in. So, without further ado, in case anybody hasn't seen yet, and the entire list can be found of both undrafted free agents and the undrafted free agents and the draft picks are both on cincyjungle.com. So at round 1, pick 11, the Bengals took Jonah Williams from Alabama, the offensive tackle. They did list him as a tackle. Round 2, pick 20 in that round, number 52 overall, tight end Drew Sample out of Washington. Round 3, pick 9, which is 72 overall, linebacker Jermaine Pratt out of NC State. Round 4, pick 2, that was a move up for quarterback Ryan Finley at number 104 overall. That was, like I said, the number 2 pick on day 3 there. Round 4, pick 23, number 125 overall, defensive tackle Rennell Wren out of Arizona State. Then they moved up for this player as well. Round 4, pick 34, number 136 overall, offensive guard / sort of center, Michael Jordan. No, not that Michael Jordan of Ohio State. With that, they lost a 5th round pick, and then they had 3 6th round picks. Number 182 overall, running back Travion Williams out of Texas A&M. Number 210 overall, Deshaun Davis, linebacker out of Auburn. Number 211 overall, another running back, Rodney Anderson out of Oklahoma. And their final pick, cornerback Jordan Brown out of South Dakota State. Now, some of the ones, I don't think we have all of them up quite yet. We're kind of sifting through the rumor mill and everything, but we do know of at least 6 undrafted free agents that the Bengals have struck deals with and or invited to camp. Stanley Morgan is probably the most notable, the wide receiver out of Nebraska. A lot of people thought he would be a late round pick. Tyree Kinnell, a defensive back out of Michigan. Jordan Ellis, a running back out of Virginia Tech. Keaton Sutherland, an offensive lineman. He plays tackle and guard, probably a guard at the next level, but we'll see. Texas A&M. Jake Dolagala out of Central Connecticut State, small school there. Quarterback Corey Contini, from another small school, Ohio Dominican, a wide receiver there. So with all of that, that is a mouthful. With all of that being said there, John, who were some of your favorite picks out of this class? Now, opinions can vary. A lot of factors to consider: value, need, all that kind of stuff. But for you, where do you sit on some of the Bengals' your favorite picks for the Bengals in this year's class?
I think you have to start with the first and third round picks because they've addressed the two biggest needs on the roster, and it was with players that fit the value of where they were supposed to go and should be able to provide immediate contributions. And of course, I'm talking about Jonah Williams and Jermaine Pratt, the offensive tackle and the linebacker. And just when, I guess, looking back at the 16-year history of Marvin Lewis and the Bengals and his draft history, the first and third rounds have been extremely hit and miss, while the second round has been more or less more consistent in finding more long-term starters and quality contributors. So you always kind of counted on that second round being like that staple spot where you have the third round being extremely volatile. And at least in recent years, or maybe just in the overall history, the first round has been quite hit or miss as well. So to leave the first round with both linebackers off the board, take the best available offensive lineman and a quality one at that can play basically anywhere you want and can come in immediately and contribute at a high level and continue to develop into an above-average starter from the pedigree of Alabama. Williams is only 21 years old. It's hard to really get a lot better than that. He may not have the athleticism and the length to develop into a multiple Pro Bowl or multiple All-Pro player, but as far as not messing up the first round, which is something that the Bengals have had trouble doing so, sans William Jackson, AJ Green in recent years, that was extremely satisfying for me, especially with the way the draft board fell, and you had guys like Cleveland Farrell go off the board and Daniel Jones that kind of helped that whole situation transpire. And then the third round, when the Bengals still haven't addressed the linebacker position, and this is still, I guess, a trend that's goes beyond just the Marvin Lewis era. The lack of addressing linebackers within the first 50 or 60 picks or so, but to kind of wait patiently for that and have Pratt kind of fall into their laps in the third round, that was a pick and a player and a fit that I've been pounding the table for since the Senior Bowl. Pratt was my favorite linebacker down there in Mobile, and his tape kind of confirms a lot of what I saw down there. A very athletic linebacker, clicks and closes very quickly, and has a little bit of issues in coverage, but I think that those things can work out. He's a former safety that transitioned to a linebacker. I think his upside is very much of that of a long-term starter and a quality contributor down the road. And honestly, I think my third favorite pick out of all this is Stanley Morgan. I had him as like an early day 3 or even a day 2 pick. I think when you look at the data in terms of production athleticism, he was amongst one of the very best receivers in this class, because you think Nebraska, one of the most storied programs in college football history, they never had a 1,000-yard receiver until Stanley Morgan Jr. just this last year. He accounted for about 33% of that passing offense, tested like a very flexible and explosive receiver. But I think he fell all the way down or out of the draft because of some character issues that were not previously identified. But I think if given a fair chance, he can very much push for not only a roster spot, but an active spot on game days and maybe contribute as early this year.
Yeah, interesting player for sure, and a guy that's got some good skills. And who knows? With this, he could be a guy that, if you remember back, I believe it was in 2014, they used a pick on James Wright, who really didn't have any production in college as an LSU wide receiver, and he ended up kind of being their number 4 wide receiver and getting in some plays. So, Morgan could potentially be that type of player with a more polished college resume. So interesting guy there, and I did like that pickup as well. My favorites, it took me a little bit to come around to the Jonah Williams pick. Not that I disliked it in general. I just saw some familiarities in terms of, Ed Oliver's sitting out there at number 9. You've got all these late picks that you would think you would use as an arsenal, maybe to move up 2 picks, 3 picks to get that player. And I think that I think he would have been a big difference maker. I think he's going to be an excellent football player. And he could have been had at basically number 8, number 9 overall, depending on the situation there. And then you have a relationship with the Bills. Maybe there's a trade that could be struck. Who knows? And then, of course, the Steelers come up, and for those people who wanted Devin Bush, you see that the Steelers go up and grab a player that probably could have been a day one starter for the Bengals in the first round, and they grab him instead. They're going to see him twice a year now, and often he's going to be going up against Jonah Williams on in certain situations. So that's going to be very interesting. That was a little frustrating, but and my hesitation with Jonah Williams as the pick was, what's the plan? What's the immediate plan on the offensive line, right? And we could talk about this a little later as well. But this is a team with its early picks, I thought and felt that they need immediate impact guys. And when you re-sign Alex Redmond, you re-sign Bobby Hart to a deal that is a little more team friendly than we initially thought, but still is pretty lucrative for a guy that did not play well last year. You have Clint Bowling there. You traded for Cordy Glenn last year, and he's set to make a decent amount of money. Right now, talent-wise, Jonah Williams should start for this football team.
Absolutely.
I don't know if, given the history, now granted this was a previous coaching regime that mostly was to be indicted about this, but they haven't always been, very open to playing certain rookies. So, I that's what worried me. But as the dust kind of settled and we got into day 2, day 3, I kind of slept on it. And I said, look, this is a guy that probably will start regardless of salary. And, hopefully the Bengals trot out the best 5 linemen, find a good fit. And I really liked the kid's headspace. As a player, my one knock on him was that Clemson national championship tape against Clellan Ferrell, who surprisingly went number 4 overall. But that was a little concerning to me. But overall, his tape is great. And he is, like you said, he's not necessarily the best athlete, but he is a very sound technician, and he is a student of the game. And if he comes anywhere near the Andrew Whitworth type of level, I think Cincinnati, will be very pleased with that pick. I liked Jermaine Pratt a little bit as well. I didn't know him as much as some of the others, but as I read more about him and his measurables, he makes a little more sense. He will be playing outside linebacker, so I like that pick. I'm looking more day 3, and what the team did day 3 is some of my favorites. And I looked at where I'm looking in particular is one pick in round 4, and that's Rennell Wren, a player out of Arizona State, an athletic freak. 6'5", about 312 pounds, a guy who is probably could push for a starting or definitely a heavy rotating type of role up front next to Geno Atkins with Andrew Billings. And I think the Bengals needed some depth there. The thing is you look at the physical traits, you look at the workout. I think he ran about 5 flat at 40 at 312 pounds, 6'5". That's ridiculous.
Right.
But the tape and the production doesn't necessarily match the traits, and that's why the guy was available in day 3. But I think with solid coaching, with surrounding talent like a Carlos Dunlap, like a Geno Atkins, maybe it frees him up to kind of do some things. The other knock on him, aside from the production, is he kind of goes rogue. He does some things where it's not really within the confines of the system, and sometimes it works out fantastic for the defense, and sometimes it is not good in terms of results. So if he can rein that in, and if he's a guy that if he can ever match the tape and the production anywhere close to the physical traits, I think the Bengals got themselves a very good football player. They usually do pretty well with those 3rd and 4th round defensive tackle type of players. The list goes on and on. Atkins and Pico and Frosty Rucker was a 3rd round pick. Pat Sims, all these guys. So I think Fat Sims, right, John? I think Rennell Wren, to me, is one of my favorite players, if not my favorite player in this class, which is weird to say for a non-sexy position and a guy in the 4th round. And they didn't really give up any capital to get him. So I just thought
got that pick from trading back in the 2nd round.
There you go. Yeah. I think that was a good move there. And you know what? I like the running backs, and I think the value is there. I think the system fit for Travion Williams in terms of what the Bengals want to run, what Jim Turner and his blockers are going to do. Being at Texas A&M, there's familiarity there. I already mentioned Sutherland is coming in, a Texas A&M lineman as an undrafted free agent. So there's a lot of pluses to that pick. Todd McShay, whatever you think of him, he absolutely raved about that pick. When he said he thought he was basically a third round type of talent that the Bengals are getting in the 6th round, and it's positional devaluation, and it's just a guy who kind of fell through the cracks. And he didn't test overly well, but it's a guy who's just productive. Every time he touches the football, he's productive. He's not overly big, and he's a guy who should help them out immensely as a third running back. Now, granted, third running backs don't play a ton, but if there's an injury, I think Zach Taylor, given the fact that they drafted 2 running backs, are probably they're going to be using running backs a little more heavily this year. I think that between the offensive line, the running back picks, all that kind of stuff. And then Anderson, without the injuries, this is a 1st or 2nd round talent. I mean, you look at him, and he is just a talented football player. Now, some of the injuries he's had have been very scary. I think there was a neck fracture in there. There was a knee issue. I think the other thing was maybe a back problem, something like that, which compiled up, he may never do anything in the NFL, but if those are behind him, if he's in a system that works well, and if he's a rotational player at the next level, this is a guy who could come in and contribute right away, even as a 3rd or 4th running back. Maybe this is even a redshirt year. Who cares? It's a 6th round pick. But he's a guy that also is familiar with the zone system that they ran at Oklahoma. Joe Mixon is, obviously part of that as well. And familiarity with the teammates. And, I think that pick was an unheralded one, especially him being the 2nd running back that they took. I just think that they're not talking too much about that. So, if you're asking me, I did like the Jonah Williams. I did like the Jermaine Pratt picks, but I liked Rennell Wren and the 2 running backs on day 3. For me, I liked those. What about your least favorite picks, John? I think a lot of people may point to one in particular, but I'm curious to hear what your picks where you kind of went, yeah, not so much a fan.
So people are going to talk about Ryan Finley. Like, that's going to be a major point of discussion when looking at this draft class, and not for the fact that he's going to push Randy Dalton's job, because that's just not going to happen. And it's not only because the Bengals have gone and said that Finley is just going to be the backup. And I think in terms of what he's going to be, it's not the worst investment in the world. But when you're trading up in the 4th round pick into the right outside the cusp of the top 100 picks, there's still, as we saw on the draft board, there's still potentially high quality players available for the taking. And the Bengals had a roster, or still have a roster, where there are still gaping holes basically all throughout the depth chart. And they couldn't turn down high quality depth at basically any position. So to go out of your way to draft a quarterback in the 4th round, who quite honestly doesn't have the potential to become a long-term starter, is extremely questionable for me. Now, I was a proponent of them trading up, because not only did I not want to write about 5-6 round picks, but 13 picks weren't going to make the roster in general. So decreasing that down to 10 was a smart move. I thought that they didn't give up a lot to pick Finley in that sense, but still, like, Finley, the only knock on him is his age. And it's because he was beaten out by an undrafted quarterback this year, Brett Rypien, at Boise State. He transferred from Boise State, became a 3-year starter at NC State, and was productive there. Like, the production wasn't bad. The film, compared to other quarterbacks outside of the ones taken in the 1st round, isn't terrible, to say the least. I think he can be a quality long-term backup. But just in terms of looking at the overlying picture of, where that pick was taken, who was still on the board, other needs that the Bengals had to address, I think objectively there's not a lot that separates Finley from other quarterbacks who were taken on day 3 that can potentially become more than what Finley can be. And that's just very, very, very unlikely that he becomes a long-term starter. And again, the plan for Finley is not to become a long-term starter. He's just going to be a long-term backup in whatever Zach Taylor plans to do in the next 5 years. He may be around longer than Andy Dalton is around, and he can potentially groom another young quarterback drafted into the system in a few years from now. So having Ryan Finley on the team doesn't necessarily make them worse. It's just a question of investment and the overall plan of where that pick happened. That is my only gripe with that. And continuing the fourth round, I do like what Randall Wren can do in terms of just in splashes, but I also think that there were better, more productive, defensive tackles that have objectively a higher upside than Wren. And I love his athleticism. I love what he did at the Senior Bowl as well. Like at least 3 or 4 of these picks were players that really dominated the Senior Bowl, which I do appreciate because I was there. But with Wren, like you said, the production wasn't there. The tape was extremely inconsistent, and I don't want to make it a lazy bias comparison in terms of just what jersey they wore, but it kind of reminded me of the Marcus Hardison pick. And not because there was a Grady Jarrett that was drafted after Randall Wren this year, but just because that there were more productive defensive tackles still on the board. Like Dalen Mack was one that we mocked on the show a couple weeks ago, and he ended up going to the Ravens. And in terms of what both of those guys can do and what roles they would play, I think Mack was the better player. And I know it's just kind of nitpicking because there's just one player, but with Wren, it would be for a player who didn't produce at all, basically, and it was also 23 and a half years old when he was drafted. It's hard to see him becoming anything more than a long-term back, similar to Finley. And again, when you still have Geno Atkins playing at a high level and you still have promising young guys in Glasgow and Billings, it's not the worst scenario in the world. And again, it's still a 4th-round pick, but I think they could have gotten better value with other players at that position. So that was my only real gripe. Initially, I had some complaints about the sample pick, but I think at the end of the day, you're looking at a potential long-term starter at the tight end position who can contribute immediately as a blocker and has some potential as a receiver in short area situations. So in terms of replacing Tyler Croft, I thought the sample pick was fine, even though I had a little bit of questions of value right after that pick happened. So for me, the 4th round was kind of where they were iffy, but I think they salvaged it a lot by trading him for Mike Jordan, who has, I think, a lot of upside as an offensive lineman, very athletic, also only 21 years old. So at the very least, my gripes were a little snuffed out by what they finished out in that round with.
I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit for you with the Finley discussion, and here's why. And truth be told, I'm with you on that. Where I'm not a fan of trading up for a backup who's
Right.
going to be a backup quarterback. I'm not a fan of giving up picks to do that. Even if they really liked him, even if he supposedly blew them away in their interviews of him, which reportedly was the case, even though the tape, while there's a lot of good, there are some issues there on tape in terms of kind of throwing balls into tight windows, and those windows kind of become a little tighter at the next level. So there are issues with that. I'm going to say this though, John, regarding Finley. I thought about it, and we've talked a long time. And when the pick was made, McShay loved Ryan Finley. I think he thought he was the 3rd or 4th best quarterback in this class. McShay was all over him, and he thought it was a great pick in round 4. And they kept saying, well, if they want to move away from Andy Dalton, blah 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 blah. We talk about and the Finley move. Make no mistake about it. The Finley selection is not he's going to replace Andy Dalton in 2019. That is not happening at all. What I do see potentially happening, there's two major benefits that I see here. Number one, there have been times in recent years where the Bengals have lost Andy Dalton. He's been a pretty durable guy his entire career, with the exception of basically 2 seasons. He's actually, the only time he's missed ever has been because of thumb issues as a rookie in 2015 and last year. So ironically, that's kind of
Both on free plays too.
Yeah. So the Bengals put forth the notion to the fans and everybody that they think, and this is why they weren't overly active in free agency, that they think if there aren't injuries, they'll be fine. They have enough talent. They'll be in the hunt. They'll be in the mix. my thing is, I didn't really buy into that, but I think Ryan Finley, as of today, can do some of the things that Andy Dalton can do. And I think the drop off from Dalton to Finley is far, far less than Dalton to Jeff Driscoll at this point. And so my thing is, if Dalton goes down in 2019, this is one of the things, I think Finley could come in and not go 1-5, 1-6 on a stretch, and maybe carry the Bengals to a 9-7 type of playoff berthish type of record. Maybe. I see more benefit as a backup in an emergency situation there. The other thing, we talk about Andy Dalton being a bridge guy in 2019 and maybe even 2020. Then they draft their guy in 2020, and Dalton plays basically the next 2 years, and that's that. As McShay mentioned, there is no dead money on cutting Andy Dalton next year. So we don't know, or getting rid of Andy Dalton in 2020. Perhaps Finley is the bridge guy in 2020 as they draft another young guy in 2020 with their first round pick, a guy in a class that seems to be more talented. And maybe Finley's a guy that they say, hey, you know what, we'll give you the job in 2020 for a much cheaper price. We'll use the Dalton money that we're saving, and maybe that goes to a franchise tag of AJ Green or something of that nature. And they've got a guy who can do in his second year, a mature guy, some of, if not most of the things Andy Dalton can do. They're able to keep some of their core offensive players, Tyler Boyd, AJ Green, intact by saving that money. And they draft another high pick in 2020, 2021. And that's the plan. So that's kind of where I sit a little bit with the Finley thing. But overall, I agree with you, John. I don't like the idea of moving up for someone who is going to immediately be a backup player, and not a backup player that's going to see snaps. This is a position it's not like a backup linebacker that's going to see some snaps on special teams, see some snaps on defense. If Dalton's healthy, this guy's not playing unless there's blowouts ensuing. So, that's my thing with it. But I do think there is some foresight going forward, and I don't know if you think I'm just gibberish here, but that's kind of my devil's advocate point on that.
I think there's just multiple ways to look at it, and this goes beyond just looking at the Finley pick, but also just how you would immediately grade drafts and just how you evaluate that in general. Like for me personally, when I look at like from a league-wide perspective about teams' draft class, I like to think long-term and long-term potential, and can these guys become long-term starters? Can these guys become Pro Bowl, All-Pro players and stuff like that? So when you think long-term, you look at the Finley pick, you look at where it was taken and what resources were going to take him. You mean to think, it's a pretty bad pick under that criteria. But when you think about the immediate plan and where a team is at the moment, and also the value of, a backup quarterback's not going to play, but he's still backing up the most important position there. So there's the counter value with that argument. So there's just multiple viewpoints to look at it. So there's always a way to counter it in that sense. And in terms of the immediate plan, having Finley as your backup quarterback is better than having Jeff Driscoll. And if that's worth giving up a useless day 3 pick, then all the power to you. And also, if you feel more comfortable with Finley over any other quarterback who had similar data and production than them, again, all the power to you. It's just, there's just always a way to counter in terms of how you evaluate it immediately. And when we look back 4 years about some of the players that they passed on to take Finley and what Finley actually did and what were his contributions to it, then we can more clearly evaluate this decision.
Yeah, and I think there's upside there. There is trust there, and I think overall, I think you would rather see them move up for a 4th rounder instead of do the whole deal, get rid of Dalton, bring in a Tannehill, all that kind of crap, for lack of better words, that we discussed this offseason that never came to fruition, despite reports. For my least favorite pick, I'm going to go a little obvious, but I'm also going to stick up for the pick and the player, okay? You mentioned his name earlier, Drew Sample, in the 2nd round. Now, he's my least favorite pick because, and it's not really because of him. It's about value. So I guess in a way that's about him. A player they probably could have gotten in the 3rd round and maybe even the 4th round, depending on reports and what you believe. He's a player that is probably going to be depending on how you look at it, and Eifert's outlook, maybe a 1B, a 2A, a third type of option potentially at tight end with a second-round pick. I'm not too big of a fan of that. The college production wasn't really there. The Met. So the other thing that I didn't really like about it is, and again, this isn't really his fault, what could have been with that pick? Because we have now heard reports that the Bengals wanted to move up potentially for Cody Ford, who would have just been another home run pick in the second round, I think, especially when you team him up with Jonah Williams. Yeah, double dipping at offensive line with your first two picks is risky, but that would immediately solve a lot of issues up front, I would think. You also had Greedy Williams, who seemed to be, now we don't know exactly of his fit in this defensive scheme. The Bengals like a little more physical type of cornerbacks, guys who do a little more press man type of stuff. Greedy Williams did some of that, but not often. He's really the rangy ball hawk kind of guy, good speed. But still, he was out there. Some other players were out there that you think could have been a little bit more intriguing than a potentially second or third tight end. But so that, to me, made it my least favorite pick. However, I'm going to defend the pick at the same time because this is a player I think could also play H-back for this team. I think he can line up in the backfield at times, not all the time, but at times, and be an outlet option. I think it was last episode or the episode before, we had a question about fullbacks and why don't the Bengals use him. I think this guy could be used in certain situations on that front. He's known as a blocking tight end, and use that plus the athleticism of being a tight end, and he could be used there. The Bengals moved back and got a pick, like you said, who turned into Rennell Wren. So at least they didn't go up and reach that way. They moved back, got an additional pick, and worked it that way. And we don't know what's going on with Eifert. CJ Uzomah has had a couple of injuries. So I think we're starting to see a shape coming through of this offense and the plan. It's going to be a controlled passing. It's going to be a lot of runs. It's going to be a lot of play action. And quite honestly, that's a lot of what we saw out of Los Angeles' offense this last year. So I think when you see the beefing up of the offensive line throughout the entire offseason, I think when you see the investment in 2 running backs in this draft, I think it's signs are pointing to this is going to be a run heavy. Let's do a lot of controlled passing, which plays to Andy Dalton's strengths. The short intermediate passing game plays to his strengths. The long balls necessarily do not. So I think from that standpoint, that was my least favorite pick, but there is a reasonable defense on that. I don't know if that makes sense to you or not, but that's kind of my take on Drew Sample in the second round.
Yeah, and like his data points towards like a slightly outside chance of becoming a long-term starter. I do like his athleticism. I do like his blocking ability, and there is value to that. It's just a matter of, do you take that in the second round? Because obviously when you're looking at tight ends, their value is in the passing game. And just looking at the tight end group right now, you're probably thinking that you have Uzomah and Sample in the fold. They're going to see significant snaps, and you have them as your traditional inline, quote-unquote, wide tight ends that you have it maybe when you go into 12 personnel. And then you have Eifert maybe playing just a big slot, just essentially a big receiver. And I think that was sort of what they were trying to do last year before he got hurt. And again, he got hurt off a freak injury, not necessarily from blocking. So I think there was a plan with that group as a whole. And yeah, they've done a lot of work to, quote unquote, to defend the value of the pick as well, and which is kind of silly because they're in NFL worms and we're just on Twitter just shouting at us at a computer screen. So there's always that interesting aspect of what was the true consensus of a player and where he was on teams' boards. Sample could have easily been like a high third round pick that wouldn't have lasted towards the Bengals 72nd overall pick. And honestly, like I even as me, like a big fan of Pratt, like maybe the second round would have been a little bit too early for him as well. So the value fit for Pratt, and if the value fit for Sample, then that's fine. And then we always play the game of like, oh, if we had taken Sample in the third, Pratt in the second, would fans be happy? And that's just a silly way to do that because you can't really do it like that. So my thing is, like, there were tight ends that were drafted in day 3 that I think could have done the same, if not more, than what Sample will do in the Bengals offense. But at the end of the day, he's a solid player who has the potential to be a long-term starter. And when you're the Bengals and you aren't active in free agency, you're trying to build your team through the draft. You want as many long-term starters as possible. And I think it's possible for Sample to develop into that as a guy who's durable, who can do multiple things for your offense. Again, like you said, he has positional versatility. He can line up in the backfield and honestly make the Bengals feel comfortable that they don't have to have Eifert be that traditional tight end that can get him into more precarious injury situations. Let him be a big receiver. Let Uzoma and Sample do the blocking. At the end of the day, there are worse picks that you can do.
Yeah, and Sample is a guy that brings some traits at the position group that those two guys do not. Uzama is not known as an outstanding blocker. Eifert is basically a flex type of option. You line him up in the slot, right. You put him out wide. Yeah, you can line him up next to the offensive line, but at most he's kind of chipping. He has improved his blocking, but he's not known as a blocking tight end either. Now, granted, it's not the greatest thing in the world to say use a second-round pick on a blocking tight end. This kid can catch, though, and I'm going to tell you this. There's an article out there. If I can find the link to it again, I'll put it in the live YouTube chat and other spots where we post this. There was somebody who watched a lot of film on Drew Sample and said, this kid is outstanding. He had zero help at quarterback, especially the past couple of seasons. If you watch Jake Browning, the quarterback of the Washington Huskies from 2015 through 2018, he had a ridiculous 2016 season where he threw 43 touchdowns against 9 interceptions. But you know who was on his team aside from Sample? John Ross, Dante Pettis, Myles Gaskin. All of those guys were there. All of a sudden, Ross leaves, Pettis starts to leave, and his numbers, he never throws more than 19 touchdowns. And if you see this breakdown, of who was talking, again, forgive me, I can't seem to find the article, but basically it talked about how Browning missed a Sample on a lot of wide open plays that could have padded his stats, made things look a little better than they were, and obviously those other weapons were primary targets over Sample. So he was lost in a little bit of a shuffle in terms of stats and all that kind of stuff. Still, not outstanding value. I think we can kind of split hairs on a lot of these picks in terms of least favorite picks and value and all that kind of stuff. But overall, I think we can say it's a solid draft class. Before we end the show, John, we'll talk about grades maybe for this class and what you would give it. But we'll get to that a little later. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. He's John Sheeran. I'm Anthony Cosenza. We've been talking about the NFL draft here on this episode of the Orange and Black Insider. You can get this show on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Spotify, on Google Play. It's also on YouTube, on the Megaphone platform, and CincyJungle.com. We'll be getting to some phone calls a little later in the episode. We've already been getting a lot of texts, so we'll be getting to some listener questions in just a little while at the end of the program. But we've got more to touch on with the NFL draft and the Bengals draft class. So stick with us. And if you're new to the program, thanks for joining us. If you're catching us after our live recording, try and join us. We usually record Wednesday evenings on CincyJungle.com and our YouTube channel. Subscribe to all of our channels to get all of our content as well.
So let's talk about big pictures things, because this is Zach Taylor's first draft, his first chance to really make a stamp on the types of players that he wants to bring in and the type of identity, I guess, that he wants to set. And the clear theme of this draft was, I don't know, I can't believe I'm saying this, establishing the run and just basically building an identity on offense and really confirming our hopes about him coming from the Rams offenses. And it's really just building an offense to try to resemble what makes the Rams so very much successful in that. And with that said, with the picks that they invested on offense, they didn't draft a receiver. And they did draft a quarterback, but not a quarterback that has any conceivable chance of taking over for Andy Dalton anytime soon. But with the picks they did pick, blocking tight end, 2 offensive linemen who I think can become quality starters in 2 to 3 years. I think Williams can be a quality starter right now, but I do have hopes for Jordan to eventually develop into that. But offensive linemen that presumably fit for what Jim Turner likes to do. Along with the addition of John Miller, I think they have at the very least a competent offensive line, which is more than what we can say about last year. And then 2 running backs, which also kind of tells me that Zach Taylor saw what the Rams offense, what happened to that when they ran Todd Gurley into the ground and had to rely on some of his backups. And while C.J. Anderson did perform well, there is always a danger of leaning too much on one running back, and I think picking 2 running backs there kind of sends a message to that we're going to run the ball, and if we can, we're going to have quality backups at both spots. So no running back, no receiver taking, and a lot of help for an offense that would greatly aid the quarterback. So does this draft class really not only institute a clear identity for this offense that definitely needs to take the next step, but also instill confidence in not only Andy Dalton, but also John Ross, because again, only Stanley Morgan was added to that receiver group. No one else was added for competition at that position. So does that also institute confidence in both of those guys for at least the next 2 years?
You mentioned John Ross, and who was the other?
Andy Dalton.
Okay, that's what I thought you said. Let's talk about John Ross here. I think that the fact that the Bengals did not draft a wide receiver in the draft and waited to get a wide receiver, a big name wide receiver, until basically the undrafted rounds, like you mentioned earlier with Stanley Morgan. I think that that says to a lot of people that Zach Taylor is ready to roll with the top 3 guys he has at that position. There were some weird trade rumors with John Ross floating around earlier this offseason. I think it shows immense trust. Now, that doesn't mean that the Bengals won't maybe scour the free agency wire at other positions. That's usually what happens this time of year. Some teams end up scouring the waiver wire or what have you to add other ancillary pieces, other pieces that are affordable based on what they got or didn't get in the draft class. So, the Bengals could look at a wide receiver there, but I think this shows trust. Zach Taylor mentioned this offseason that John Ross, they like what they think they can get out of him in this offense. And to be quite honest with you, that he is very similar in terms of mold, skill set, all of that, and how he could potentially fit in this offense. Very similar to Brandon Cooks or a Robert Woods in the Rams offense. Those guys both had double-digit touchdowns and over 1,200 yards receiving last year. So I'm not saying John Ross is going to have that type of year, but I think this is a play action, oftentimes get the ball out quick, maybe yards after the catch type of opportunities, things that we wanted to see more in terms of usage with John Ross. I think that this offense is going to be doing that, and it's going to be less predictable. I think if you can, oddly enough, John Ross found the end zone pretty often in college, but oddly enough, he was like a red zone target last year, and you would think he was more the deep ball, the big play type of guy. He made big plays, but a lot of them were 10 to 20 yards from the end zone, not necessarily 50 yards or what you would envision from a guy like that. I think if you kind of if you build off of that a little bit and you're able to find a guy that can move the sticks a little more often, find a guy that can do things, you set up more yards after the catch opportunities, I think that will allow him to be a good third option in this class. It also means, aside from John Ross, that apparently this team still has faith in Josh Malone and Cody Core, at least on some level, and Alex Erickson as another. Maybe this means that Alex Erickson is going to get a bigger shot in the offense instead of being more of primarily a special teams guy. That's a different discussion. But for now, I think John Ross is the team trusts him. Andy Dalton, we kind of discussed him with the Finley situation. I don't know if this means long-term trust with Andy Dalton, but I think that this team is telling you we're comfortable with what we have in terms of winning now. And Andy Dalton right now presents us with the best opportunity to win with a healthy roster at these other positions in terms of what was available in this draft class, in terms of what they could have got in free agency or trades or what have you. Andy Dalton is the best guy for this offense and what they can do. I agree on a lot of levels, maybe not every level, but I agree with that sentiment. And if there's one thing just to kind of close up, wrap a little bow on what I'm saying here, John, if there's one thing that this draft class told me, I don't know that this team is going to be vastly improved from a starters standpoint from this draft class and from what they did in free agency. But if they're selling us on the idea that if this team is healthy, or if they keep a lot of guys, or if they, if the main players are there, that they'll be competitive, I believe that if the injury bug hits them again this year, I believe they are better prepared to be competitive than they have been since 2015. 2015, they were 3 players deep at like every position. But 2016, 2017, 2018, that wasn't the case. Injuries hit and they didn't have the windfall. I think this year, I don't know if they're going to be much better. Remember, they got off to that hot start last year. I don't know if they're going to be much better from a starter's perspective. Maybe some improvements here and there, offensive line, John Ross growth, whatever. But I think if those injuries hit again, they will be much better prepared to still be competitive in the season, whereas they went, like I said, 1-5, 1-6 under Driscoll and all these other guys that were out.
And I think that's a fair point, because you look in what that basically means is that you're hoping that this coaching staff and Taylor gets the most out of the young guys that unfortunately Lewis's staff weren't able to do. And most of those players either belong either on the front 7 or also in the receiving position. And looking back at what you said about the wide receivers and the so-called lack of investment there, is that there is a lot of untapped potential with guys like Malone, with guys like Erickson, even maybe a guy like Auden Tate. Something that popped up on my timeline today was Joe Goodberry was tweeting out about average yards of separation for the Bengals receivers compared to the average yards of separation for the Rams receivers. And even for a guy like AJ Green, it's night and day that the Rams had a lot more space to work with at the catch point compared to guys like the Bengals. And that even
almost like a yard per player, right?
And the Rams receivers are very talented. Cooper Kupp, Robert Woods, Brandon Cooks, all those guys are really talented. But a lot of that is predicated due to scheme and just getting guys in space, getting guys open. You mentioned John Ross only catching 7 touchdowns, all in the red zone. And honestly, that should be a telltale sign that this guy can create separation in tight spaces. And if he gets the ball, maybe not necessarily 30 yards down the field, but just 5 yards down the field, and you have space for him to create yards after the catch, he can get more productive and he can be more utilized. So I think this is them saying that we want to get the most out of the talent here, but just better utilization of them compared to what was before. Because I think they had a plan for Ross to be just this deep threat, and they didn't exactly utilize him to his full potential for the rest of his skill set. Going back to Dalton, though, and the overall plan of the offense, because you mentioned like play action, run heavy, opens up a lot of different things with that, and it was good for the Rams, because Goff definitely thrived off it compared to looking at him from Jeff Fisher and Sean McVay, because McVay had a plan. They surrounded him with extremely quality talent on the offensive line first and foremost, and I think they have at the very least a competent offensive line to do the things that they want to now, and they also have quality pass catchers that hopefully will develop more. So with all that helping him, that's the optimistic side point. The pessimistic is you're hiding the quarterback, because you don't trust him to basically elevate all the talent around him. And you can yell at me all you want, but that's basically the reality of the situation, because the Rams did a great job of hiding Goff and giving him easy throws to make down the field, and his production thrived off of that. And when it got into more pressing situations late in the season, in the postseason, and certain defensive coordinators were able to figure him out, then Goff kind of had to do things on his own, and what turned out to be they only scored 3 points in the Super Bowl against the Patriots. So it's a fine plan up until you get to that point, and you just have to hope that the system is still in place where it can help him out for as long as it goes. But you also have to hope that Taylor has a plan in case things don't always work out in that system, and a plan to hopefully get Dalton to be better than what he has been in the past 8 years. Because if you're going to rely on all the surrounding talent to essentially hide Dalton, you have to make sure that things don't completely fall apart if defenses figure out what you're doing.
Totally agree, and I think we've touched on this a little bit in a past episode, but I mean, I think that we keep talking about the Rams offense. It's not going to be exactly the same, but I think the overall blueprint, I guess, will be the same. I mean, things ran around a good offensive line and Todd Gurley doing a lot of different things in the offense. The Bengals, Joe Mixon may not be Todd Gurley, but he's close. I mean, he can do a lot of things. Big back, a guy who can catch, a guy who can run both outside of the tackles and in between the tackles. And then you can mix it up with some of these other backs they just added, Giovanni Bernard. They brought in John. and granted, some of these guys are guys we're not fans of, but you have to give the Bengals credit about the offensive line. Major issues over the last 2 seasons. Cordy Glenn, Billy Price. This offseason, Bobby Hart, Alex Redmond re-signed. They bring in John Miller. They draft Jonah Williams. They draft Michael Jordan. I mean, they're bringing in a lot of guys to help fix that offensive line and obviously mold it into something that they want it to become, probably close to what Los Angeles did. So I think that you got to give them credit based on all of these moves. I probably missed 1 or 2 in there as well. I think I said John Miller, but everybody wanted them to tweak the offensive line, and they've done about 5 or 6 types of moves this offseason alone. In terms of helping out that offensive line. So
it's always baby steps.
What that means in terms
it's always baby steps, because last year we wanted them to address the problem and they did, and then when it was week 1 they ended up starting Alex Redmond and Bobby Hart. So now we want them to continue addressing the problem, but also actually solve it, and that would include probably starting Jonah Williams and keeping Bobby Hart and Alex Redmond on the bench. Be a great next step.
Yeah. So we'll see what those 5 offensive linemen on and end up being in terms of who starts and all that stuff. But at least they've done a little bit or a lot really to help fix what's going on up there. Quickly, John, before we get to some listener questions, what do you think about what this class symbolizes in terms of? I gave my bit a little bit about maybe looking towards Taylor's system and or that of the Rams. I think there's a big emphasis on character.
Yeah, for sure. And like Pratt was a team captain. Obviously, Williams just oozes character as well. I'm sure Sample is along the same lines. Finley was, I think, a finalist for the Scholar Athlete of the Year award in college football. Deshaun Davis was the defensive captain at Auburn. A lot of guys who have a lot of leadership experience. And obviously, when you have a first-time head coach, if you have the guys who are on the youngest on the young part of the spectrum in terms of age who come in having that experience. Jordan Miller was also the cornerback out of South Dakota State. He was also a team captain there. If you have guys who come into the roster and come in to try to take spots, but have that experience of being leaders of men in the locker room, it definitely helps out. And this is something that we also talked about with retaining veteran free agents in terms of making that transition with that. So definitely an emphasis on guys who are coming in ready to work. And honestly, that's really the difference between reaching your potential and not, because it's similar to last year. They didn't take a lot of high floor guys that have the potential to become Pro Bowlers, but they did take guys that will have the mindset that will help them reach their potential. And that really goes for Jonah Williams more than anyone, in my opinion, because I think his potential is probably capped out as an above average long-term starter. Not like it's a bad thing, but based off the person that he is and the work ethic that he has, that he's going to do everything in his power to reach that. And that was that's the difference between him and a guy like Cedric Ogbuehi, who has the athletic potential and upside to be a high quality player, but didn't have the drive and the ethic to actually reach that. So that's definitely a point of emphasis for Zach Taylor, at least in this class, and just establishing some type of identity on the roster and on the offense. We had a feeling that he was going to be offensive heavy because he's an offensive coach in his first draft, and that's certainly was the case. But it was multiple running backs, multiple offensive linemen, and a blocking tight end. Definitely attacking a certain needed identity, but with similar guys with similar intangibles.
Yeah, and I think aside from that, aside from he preached character, all that kind of stuff. I think aside from that, there's a familiarity both with the players and the scheme. Travion Williams, A&M guy, knows what's going to be asked of him in terms of the blocking in front of him and running assignments, all that kind of stuff. If Sutherland ends up making this team, it's obviously because he's familiar with Jim Turner and everything that goes in line with that. So it's familiarity, it's with scheme, and it's obviously character. Now you mentioned Stanley Morgan maybe had a little bit of character red flags, but that's an undrafted guy, and that's really where you take chances on guys like that. But I mean, hard pressed to find anybody that they drafted that has any red flags. And I think you said it now. I know you said it before we took the air. A lot of defensive captains or captains in general on their team, guys with a lot of responsibilities in terms of football IQ and responsibilities on the field. And if you don't know the story of Deshaun Davis, the Auburn linebacker, he may never be a starter. He may not even last on this team very long. But go read about this kid. Apparently, when he was young, a middle school teacher told him he was either going to be dead or in jail by the age of 18. Maybe because he was a little mischievous or whatever, but and his upbringing and all that kind of stuff. What that guy did is he parlayed everything into a scholarship to play at Auburn. And then obviously go into the NFL. So pretty cool story there. Hopefully we're talking about a guy like that down the road where it's like, wow, what a cool story. And, that's kind of also one of the things I liked about day 3. Some of these guys that are there that you don't know much about, you hear about them and then you go, oh, wow. And of course he was a defensive captain for Auburn and had quite a few responsibilities as well, especially as a senior. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. He's John Sheeran. I'm Anthony Cosenza. We're going to get to some listener questions here in just a second. We've already got a couple of texts. If you do want to call in, we'll try to get to a call or two here. But you can get at us at 949-542-6241. We'll also be looking at the YouTube chat to see if there's some interesting questions there. If you can't join us live, you can get this program on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Spotify, on Google Play. You can also get it on the Megaphone platform as well as YouTube and Cincy Jungle. All of our content is on cincyjungle.com. Subscribe to our channels and get in touch with us how you can. We love feedback. I saw a ton of comments on our videos coming up here, so appreciate that. We've got a call coming in here, John, so we're going to try and get to this here. This is the Orange and Black Insider. Who's this?
Hey, it's John from Kentucky.
John.
Good evening, gentlemen.
John, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, man. I'm really excited about the Bengals draft. And, some people were kind of downing Drew Sample. And I thought, man, have you people watched the Bengals? When Andy Dalton has a healthy tight end, how he goes down the field against just about any defense. Now, Sample may not be as quick as Eibert, but if he could be healthy and get open sometimes, I mean, I think it's an excellent pick myself. Maybe not for the second round. I don't know. I'm not a draft expert, but I love the pick. And I'll tell you what, I'll even back up a little bit on Drake Kirkpatrick. Give him one chance, one season, see what he does under a different coach. And I was kind of switching gears there, but back to Sample again. I think it's a good pick. Anthony, what do you think?
Well, we talked about Sample a little bit earlier in the program. Sample's a guy, right. I think there are pros and cons to the pick. I think for some, it really depends on what you look at. I think he is a play. I think the comparison for some is like a Jack Doyle. I saw there's a Vanette. Was it Nick Vanette, the Ohio State kid? I think John, you may have put that out.
That was Joe.
Yeah, on Twitter there. He's a guy that is comparable. So, he's a guy, look, I don't think he's ever going to be an outstanding player in terms of statistics. I don't think he's ever going to be a Pro Bowl player, which is what you want out of a second-round pick, but I think he's going to be a valuable role guy. I think he can use him and move him around in a lot of different spots. Like I said, I envision him in an H-back type of role at times. He's a goal line weapon, which is what the team needs to score touchdowns. They can't settle for field goals. They need to score points, which they struggled with, especially towards the end of the season last year. And like I said, and like you just said, John, this is a team that has had injuries at that spot. They had injuries at wide receiver last year, and it hurt them. They couldn't move the football, so they need weapons, weapons. And I think that is. I think some of the best football for Sample is coming. I don't think we've seen some of the best football in terms of stats and production based on some erratic quarterback play in college and him falling down the pecking order in terms of a passing option. So I don't think he's ever going to be a George Kittle. I don't think he's going to be some of these other guys, but I think he could be a movable piece that could be a decent contributor for this team.
Well, you had an outstanding podcast the other day when you said nobody really gave a close enough look at the fact that the Bengals, the offense, was 3 and out too often. We kept bashing the defense, and we kept, bashing the coach. He'd been here too long, you name it. But one big issue, when Tyler Eifert went down, the Bengals, they started off 4-1, and the defense was getting turnovers, but the offense was going down the field. And what happens? What position? Tyler Eifert, not his fault. Love the guy. He's gone again. And the Bengals just don't move the football as well as they do with a good tight end on the field. Now, I'm not trying to make Drew Sample into something he's not, but so many times watching the NFL over the years, have I seen Gronkowski, Keith Miller, guys like that get their quarterback out of a jam. Mm-hmm. They're wide open 15 yards right down the middle of the field. And when Andy Dalton has his tight end, Eifert, he's open, he just goes right down the field against just about any defense that I've seen. Been watching Andy Dalton a lot of years. So, if I am the Bengals coaching staff, and here's a tight end, he's big, 255 pounds, it's the second, yeah, I grab him. That's just me. I grab him quick. I don't care what anybody says. I want a tight end for Andy Dalton badly. Yeah, because Tyler Eifert's coming back, Anthony, but what if he goes out in 3 games? Right. Not to be too cynical here, but it's happened too many times. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're right, and I think like we said, in defense of the Sample pick, the Bengals moved back and got an additional pick. I'm gonna move on here, John. There's one aspect we're gonna talk about off the air, but thanks for calling in, bud. So the thing he's referring to when he said something I said after the draft analysis, John, and I wanted to get your take on it. My thing is, we bagged the defense, and rightfully so. Tackling was awful. They looked confused a lot of times last year. But I think what nobody talks about is, especially when the injuries started to hit, the offense kept going 3 and out, 3 and out, 3 and out, and putting the defense, even when they got the occasional stop, the team was rushed. The defense was rushed back out there, and disastrous results usually ensued. So I wanted to get your thoughts a little bit on that, if you think there's any kind of stock or weight on that type of stance.
Sure, but I don't think Drew Sample himself is going to stop all those problems.
No,
I think a lot of that was an attribute to Bill Lazor's incompetence as a play caller, and also Andy Dalton's occasional incompetence as a quarterback when he's not surrounded by all-pro talent like a Tyler Eifert. But again, I like what Sample brings, but he's not a world beater at the position. And yeah, he wasn't that productive at Washington, but all the great tight ends in the last 20 years of the NFL have all been productive in college, and they don't really get that excuse with that. You'd like to think that he develops into a Heath Miller type player that can just be a nice underneath option on third down. But again, he still has to develop into that. And he's 23 years old. He's not exactly a spring chicken. He was a 4th or 5th year senior coming out of Washington. So there are things to like about Sample, but there's limitations that tell me that this is more of a guy that can replace what Tyler Kroft did, not necessarily what Tyler Eifert did. They don't have a guy that can replicate what you would lose if Tyler Eifert goes out for an injury. And if he does go out with an injury, it'll be interesting to see how this new staff compensates for that.
We got a text, I believe it's from Nathan, 567 area code, with Zach Taylor as the new head coach in the offense he's bringing from LA, comparing the two receiving cores. Which role will our receivers play that the Rams did? For example, will John Ross be their Brandon Cooks, or is that an AJ Green role, or is it going to be different?
That's a good question, because I think it's pretty obvious that Boyd would be Cup, because Cup was mainly in the slot, and not just a underneath guy, but also a guy that they had a lot of deep routes and a lot of vertical routes. And I think that's something that they can use Boyd a lot with too, because he's a pretty good route runner down the field. Robert Woods was more traditionally the X alpha number 1 receiver, and that's probably what Green's going to be in terms of just the full route tree. And then you have Cooks, a lot of jet sweeps, a lot of mesh concepts over the middle. and a lot of doing that underneath stuff kind of builds towards vertical routes later in the game, and I think that fits right up John Ross's alley, not just in terms of size, but just in terms of overall ability. And it's like there are two very different receiving cores in terms of what types of receivers fill those spots, but in terms of roles, those are probably how they're going to correlate with that. And I don't want to compare in terms of talent because I don't want to take away anything that the Rams guys do, but they don't have a guy like AJ Green, unfortunately. Robert Woods is good, but he's not AJ Green at that position. And, you know, not giving away to anything for Cooper Kupp, but I think you could argue that Tyler Boyd has more natural talent to him. So there's potential for similar production out of all three of those guys compared to what the Rams do. But I think those roles are pretty much how they're going to be.
Got another text here, John, Dan from Tennessee. Show rocks. Hey, thanks, Dan. I don't know if I can get to all of this because it's a longer text, but basically opinion of draft, time will tell, but I think you have possibly 3 starters for this year, and the value in the 6th round was simply a coup. He mentions Jonah Williams being a Whitworth type. He gives basically this is grade time. He says he gives the draft class a solid A. What would you give it?
Probably not an A, because if you want to compare it to all the other draft class, I think a lot of other teams took chances on players who could become more than just long-term starters. And unfortunately for the Bengals, long-term starters is probably the highest potential in terms of what the players that they took. But the first 3 picks, I think they can all become long-term starters with more leaning towards Jonah and Pratt. Sample probably has some work to do to reach that level. And yeah, the 6th round had some tremendous value with both running backs. I like both of those guys in terms of where they were picked, what roles that they will fill. I think Deshaun Davis is good enough to push Hardy Nickerson off, so that obviously deserves an A grade for me for just that pick alone. but I probably wouldn't go as far as an A, because I think you need guys that develop into high quality players down the road. I think B minus probably fits a little bit more. And that's around the same as what I gave them for last year. But at least last year, I was more pessimistic about their 1st round pick, whereas compared to this year, I thought if they didn't go quarterback with Dwayne Haskins and they couldn't get a linebacker, then Jonah Williams was by far the best way to go. So just having that 1st round pick weighted more heavily probably puts us up to B minus or B for me.
B minus or B. Do you think Jonah Williams is the best offensive lineman in this draft?
I think right now he's the best. I think there's a guy like an Andre Dillard that can develop into someone better just because he's more athletic, but he still has to get there. So like right now, Williams is above Dillard, and Williams will slowly progress up, whereas Dillard could go like this, but could also he could also not develop, and is also on the older side. So right now, I think Williams is the best, and I think he has the best chance of being a positive contributor early. And I think he's like a blue chip stock, right? You can invest in him. You can just not worry about it. He's gonna be fine. Yeah,
maybe a tiny bit lower ceiling, but a higher floor.
Right.
It seems like, if you want to use a cliche there. And this one came through from Spencer, a text here, and we'll maybe get out of here on this one. Observation / question about Jermaine Pratt, who you mentioned as one of your favorites in this year's class. Edge is a hot item in the NFL, and the Bengals didn't really draft an edge.
No, they didn't.
Right. Which I know had to just irk you.
They betrayed me. They had all this interest in edges, and they take one.
Yeah. And by the way, our mock drafts got blown to hell. God. Edge is a hot item in the NFL. After watching Pratt's film, he lined up a lot, quote, on the edge. Is he more of a dual threat than just an outside linebacker? Well, he played middle linebacker, but he did rush the passer at times. He grabbed a couple of sacks. The Bengals, apparently, he's a guy that's going to be replacing, it seems, Vontaze Burfict on that weak side. They'll play Vigil and others on that other side. But do you see him kind of being a guy that can put his hand in the dirt and get into the passer, or is this going to be still a little bit more of a traditional linebacker for this team?
That would be so incredibly Bengals if they drafted Carl Lawson just to make him a pseudo off-ball linebacker. Pratt to be like a hand of the dirt pass rusher who's also a linebacker. Yeah, no, I don't think that's the case. It's not like we're slowly going to push Pratt towards the line of scrimmage. He started as a safety, started 1 year as a linebacker, and now we're going to put it at the edge. No, he's going to be. I think replacing Burfict is the best path for him as a weak side linebacker. Run and chase. Pursuit, not knife through the line of scrimmage. I think that's perfect for him and his skill set, because he's like a heat-seeking missile. Like, he's probably the best, if not one of the best pure tacklers in this class. Yeah. I think that's some more you can say about Devin White or Devin Bush. While they were productive in terms of tackles, they had some issues in terms of missed tackles. That wasn't really an issue with Pratt. And just the 1 year they started at linebacker, he was a tackling machine there. He produced like a Pro Bowler in terms of solo tackles. So I'm very comfortable with him being a linebacker, and he can blitz as an off-ball guy, similar to that of a Devin Bush. So if they do have issues rushing the passer during games, calling upon him for a couple of delayed blitzes wouldn't be the worst thing in the world.
Yeah, and Pratt, obviously the Devons wowed everybody with their, mid 4.4s, 40-yard dash. But, hey, this kid's 6'2", 240, and I think he ran a sub 4.6.
Yeah, 4.57.
Yeah, so, that's nothing to sneeze at.
The fastest they have, by far.
Yeah.
If not Malik Jefferson.
Yeah. Yeah. So, that's nothing to sneeze at. The kid can move a little bit. And, I think that's faster than Vigil. Vigil did his deal was the cone drills and all that kind of stuff where he excelled. But, in terms of speed, he's probably actually, like you said, the fastest in terms of straight line speed that the Bengals have. I think it is a little worrisome that they drafted two guys who played in the middle as linebackers. I didn't really see a ton of outside rangy guys. I think you could probably get some stuff out of Devin Bush and Devin White in terms of moving them around. But the Bengals seem to be set with Preston Brown, Jermaine Pratt, Nick Vigil. Maybe they grab another guy in free agency here on the cheap, a rental deal to round out the group. We'll see. I didn't give my grade on the last from the text. I believe it was from, who was it, Dan or whatnot. But I would say I'd go B. I'd go right around with you. I'd say a B. I think part of that is they didn't grab some of the sexy picks. There's a couple of things I disagreed with, but I kind of slept on it a little bit, and all of a sudden these picks are making more sense to me. Like I said, I think it's about character. It's about high floors with a lot of these guys. Guys that can come in and do some things right away, maybe not start, but and you got to give the Bengals credit. They wanted to retool the offensive line, and they did that. So I don't know if it was absolutely outstanding. I liked some picks a lot. I was kind of just shoulder shrugging some others, but I didn't necessarily hate any picks. I wouldn't say going forward, but obviously time will tell. Ask us again in 3 years, and we'll let you know. This is the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. He's John Sheeran. I'm Anthony Cosenza. We appreciate all the feedback, the calls. Sorry, we got a lot of calls throughout the show. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but we tried to get to as many texts and all that kind of stuff as we could. A lot to talk about this week. In case you missed it, we put up a lot of stuff on our audio feeds and our video feeds about reactions to most of the picks throughout the weekend, as well as a wrap-up of all of the picks. So check that stuff out after you check out this episode, of course. And you can get this episode and every other on iTunes, on Stitcher, on Spotify, on Google Play. You can also get it on the Megaphone platform, YouTube, and all of our stuff is on cincyjungle.com. John, any final thoughts before we jet out of here, my friend?
No, I'm just preparing for a 2020 mock draft next week.
Okay. Okay.
Very much kidding. Very much.
Okay. Okay. I was going to say, oh boy, we better pump that thing.
I already have that muted on Twitter.
Okay. Are you almost? You got to be almost out for summer, right? Or is that a little
for the live listeners? I graduated in 2 days. I'm kind of freaking out here.
Oh boy, real world Johnny.
He's coming with no remorse.
So is the background going to change? Because isn't that your off?
The background will stay. There might be some additions here as we progress into the off season.
Okay.
But the location will stay the same for the time being.
Okay. It was a fun week. It was busy, but again, kudos to the Cincy Jungle staff, including you, John, for putting up a lot of good stuff, and there's a lot of news to keep up with. And for those who saw the staff at Cincy Jungle put up the picks right away. Analyses came pretty soon after on all those picks. So kudos to John, Jason, Nick, Matt, Patrick, both Patricks, everybody who submitted a lot of stuff throughout the weekend. It was a group effort, and it was really well done. Just quickly, for those who followed me on a different podcast before we started this one, many of you know a listener named Fatal Content. He's an ardent Bengals guy and a really entertaining guy. He called into our old program a lot. I think he's called into this program once or twice, but he lost his mom recently. I found out on Twitter, and he's a good dude, good Bengals guy. So, Fatal, if you're listening, we're with you, man. That's a tough thing to go through, and don't be a stranger around these parts either. We want to hear from you. So, for those of you who follow him on Twitter, I think many of our listeners do. Give him some condolences and give some good thoughts his way. Hope you enjoyed the draft weekend. Hope you enjoyed the coverage we brought you. Get the show how you can, John. Thanks for everything, and we'll catch you next episode, my friend.
See you guys next week.
All right. This has been the Orange and Black Insider for John Sheeran. I'm Anthony Cosenza. We'll see you next time.